So this is a video discussing Unit 5, Congenital and Genetic Abnormalities. So really, we are an expression of our genetic material. Humans have about 30,000 genes, fruit flies have about 13,000, yeast has about 6,000. So there are a lot more variability. Humans are more complex. That's all that that's saying. But we are an expression of that. But we are very closely related. So the genetic code, the human genome, is very extensive. And when you consider that genes are thousands and thousands of triplets, and we have 30,000 genes, it's a huge number. There is very little variation amongst people. Right now there's a lot of discussion about there is no genetic basis for race, for instance, that we are much more closely related than most people would give credit for. So what do genes do? Genes are basically the recipe for making a protein. And like all recipes, there can be some variation. And the idea is so that you can reliably reproduce the recipe. For example, my grandmother's apple pie probably is not exactly the same as your grandmother's apple pie. It is, it's going to be related, it'll be very close, but the type of apple, the proportion of apples and sugar and cinnamon, etc., will all vary subtly and give a slightly different flavor. But basically, it's making apple pie. The same thing can happen in making proteins. The recipe for making proteins is a gene, and there can be very subtle shifts in the order of the amino acids, or a substitute of one amino acid for another, that will give the protein slightly different characteristics, but not significantly. For instance, the protein melanin. Melanin, it accounts for skin color. Now, the recipe that I have to make melanin makes a protein that gives a reddish hue to my skin tone. My beard was auburn before it was completely gray. The red hair runs in my family, and my skin has a reddish tone to it. Other people will have more of a greenish tone, an olive color. Other people will have more of a brown color. A friend of mine in university was from Nigeria, and he was ebony black, like his skin was black, not dark brown. Some people have a yellowish cast to their melanin, but it's all melanin, and the recipe varies. Now, those recipes get transmitted through generations by the genetic code. There can be mistakes in that transmission, and it can get altered. So mistakes in the copying of it. And some of these mutations will be for the better, some of them will be for the worse, most of them will be irrelevant. So your genetic code comes from your parents, and so the traits come the same way, and they get them from their parents, etc., etc. Just last week, I had an interesting thing happened to me. I was walking in the woods near my hometown with a friend, and we came across somebody else that was walking the opposite direction, and she's my cousin. Her mother was my dad's first cousin. Her grandmother and my grandmother were sisters. We share great-grandparents. I knew of her. I think I maybe have met her once or twice in the past. But she was a friend of my friend. And what was crazy is that I was looking at her, and she looks like a young version of my grandmother. Like, it's uncanny. The same eyes and the same shape of the nose and kind of set of the cheek and kind of the same body build, or very similar anyways. And there was no question that she's related. This happens all the time. These traits that you share with your family, and this all has a genetic basis to it. So just to remind you, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. One of each pair comes from your mother, and one of each pair from your father. 22 pairs are not related to sex, and only the 23rd pair are. So the X chromosome, women have 2 X chromosomes, and men have an X and a Y, genetically speaking. Chromosomes are the collections of genes. They're arranged in pairs. The 22 that are not involved with sex are called autosomes. Genes are the collection of triplets that code for an amino acid in the chain of amino acids that makes a protein, and the code is made up of 3 of 4 different nucleotides, A, T, C, and G, in terms of DNA, and they control kind of day-to-day function and protein synthesis. Chromatin is what we call the chromosome when it's unraveled and being used. During mitosis or meiosis, it condenses down into little X-shaped chromosomes that each side of the X, each arm of the X is paired. So those are called chromatids. And I've already mentioned autosomes and the sex chromosomes, the X and Y. Again, to remind you, genotype is the genetic composition of you, of each individual. This is the triplets, the codons, as it were. Phenotype is the expression of those. So we only express one gene out of the pair. So you might have a gene, say, for hair color from your mother and another one from your father. Your genotype would be both. Your phenotype will be whichever one you express. So we call these genes alleles. So there will be an allele for almost every trait. And you'll have one allele from your mother and one allele from your father. The allele that you express into your phenotype is called the dominant allele. And the one that you don't express, but maybe will pass on to your children, is called the recessive allele. It's not expressed. We use Punnett squares to be able to work out probabilities of it being passed to the next generation. Here's an example of a Punnett square. So if they're heterozygous, which means that the two alleles are different, if both parents are heterozygous, you have 25% probability of a homozygous dominant, a 25%, that's here, a 25% probability of homozygous negative, and 50% of being heterozygous. So that would be the genotype. The phenotype of this would be 75% the dominant trait, and 25% would be the recessive trait. So that's, again, what this is showing. Now, the next generation can end up with these sorts of things. But this is a completely different, this is a tangent that we won't bother going on. I will post something for those that are interested of another YouTube video that I've done on this. So, autosomal recessive disorders, you need two carrier parents. For the child to have the problem means that they have to be homozygous recessive. And so if there's two carrier parents, which are heterozygous parents, then 25% of the offspring will have the disease. My son has a disease called autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease. So my wife is a carrier for the disease. She doesn't have it, so she's heterozygous. And his biological father was a carrier for that disease as well. He didn't have it. Jeff ended up getting it. Now, for the autosomal dominant disorders, you would need to have one parent affected with the disorder. So the bad gene is the dominant gene. So you have to have a minimum of one affected parent, because to get the bad gene, at least one of your parents has to have it. And if they have it, that's the one that's expressed into their phenotype. Now, if there's two affected parents, then absolutely it can happen. The X-linked recessive disorders are not on the autosomal chromosomes, but on the X chromosome. They don't tend to be on the Y, because the Y chromosome is very diminutive. So for it to happen, dad can be normal, but mom can be a carrier. So the recessive disorder will be on the X chromosome, on one of the X chromosomes of mom. Theoretically, the mother could be affected as well. Or you can have an affected father and a carrier mother to have that for girls to get the X-linked recessive disorder, they have to have 2 bad X chromosomes. So dad has to be affected. So this would be, for girls, affected father and a carrier or an affected mother. Normal father and affected mother will give girls the disorder. Normal father and a carrier mother will only give boys the X-linked recessive. So, affected father and a carrier will have affected males, affected females, or unaffected males, or carriers. So you can follow this through. This all seems to make sense when we're talking about single genes, but a lot of traits are multifactorial or polygenic. Many genes involved. Sometimes having the bad gene in your genotype, and maybe even in your phenotype, just predisposes you to the disease, and without the environment to set it off, it doesn't express. There's a saying that is, genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger. So a lot of cancers, for instance, are this. And these are the things that run in families. So, for instance, my family, bowel cancer runs in my family. My father had bowel cancer. My grandmother, his mother, died of bowel cancer. His brother had bowel cancer. On my mother's side, my uncle had bowel cancer, and my aunt had bowel cancer. So there's a very good chance that I have the genes that make me susceptible to bowel cancer. I've been getting colonoscopies since I was 40, looking for it. I get them on a regular basis. So far, I haven't had any issues. So the factors that trigger it haven't surfaced, whether it's my diet or whether it's the fact that I don't smoke and I've never smoked, who knows? But so that disease is multifactorial. Genetics plays a part in it. Other things are polygenic. So there's more than one gene that is involved. Now, mutations happen all the time. They happen during mitosis, and they make copies of themselves. Now, this gets interesting because a mutation in an autosomal cell may affect the function of the person, like and maybe cause a tumor or something like that, and can cause problems with that person. But if it's in an autosomal cell, it doesn't enter the gametes and doesn't pass along. For it to be an inheritable thing, an inheritable mutation, the mutation has to happen in the gametes, in the sperm or the egg cell. Now, mutations happen all the time, and we call the things that cause mutation mutagens. So that could be things like drugs, radiation, injury, all kinds of things. But very few of them actually become genetic disorders. And genetic disorders are things that are inherited from your parents. So they're mutations that happen in previous generations and come down through the gametes. Now, genetic disorders may be present right at birth. They may not surface until later in life. They may even terminate the pregnancy if it happens during fetal development and there is no and it's not compatible with life. A lot of things, well, we just talked about it, about the different alleles that would code slightly differently for proteins. The allele is dominant if it's expressed. It's recessive if there is no dominant allele present, then it gets expressed. If there is a dominant allele present, then the recessive does nothing, but can be passed along to your children. Most of us have recessive genes. They can cause issues if they get passed along and become a homozygous recessive and can develop things. Sometimes these mutations that happen in mitosis can happen during mitosis if there's a mutagen that happens during the production of that gamete. So that's why when you go get dental x-rays, they put the lead apron over you, and especially over your gonads, because what they're trying to do is prevent this from happening. Congenital disorders are disorders that are present or obvious at birth. About half of the congenital malformations have genetic causes, but that means the other half can have environmental causes. So those are called teratogens. That literally means monster formers. During the first few weeks, especially the first trimester of development, the organ systems are developing, and a teratogen can be really nasty at that time. So let's end this video here, and we'll pick up on single gene disorders in the next video.